everybody? Can we get everybody's attention? Okay. Welcome back to another hour of training. You got lunch, but was it worth it, right? Okay. All right. You remember what arrangements are? Everybody? Those are any kind of arrangement, right? Any kind of a transaction that goes on between a hospital and United, where there is compensation involved. Okay. Now this is the last hour for the people who were listed. At the end of the hour, we will go through and help you fill out the form. And then the other lucky ones who get to stay for the other 2 hours will remain. Oops. I'm not any better at this one. Wait. Got the lightest touch. Okay. All right, arrangements training. This is what we're required to do for either 1 or 3 hours. These are arrangements that potentially implicate the anti-kickback statute or the STARF law. That means that they're violations, they're just ones where there could be a violation if it wasn't done correctly. So that's what we're going to talk about. We have to talk about that. We have to talk about United's policies, procedures, and other requirements relating to arrangements, including the tracking system, which you're going to learn about. Your obligation to know legal requirements, I can tell you that very easily. You have an obligation to know legal requirements. The sanctions that are possible under the anti-kickback statute and the STARF law, and relevant examples. And what we're going to do is we're going to do a condensed version in the first hour, and we'll do an expanded version in the other 2. Okay, the anti-kickback statute, as I told you before, is a criminal statute. It requires that you do something knowingly and willfully. Okay, so it's just not an accident. Knowingly and willfully. Directly or indirectly. Excuse me. Overtly or covertly. Sorry about that. I'll hold it next time. Okay, so directly or indirectly, meaning you can do it, right to the hospital, or you can have somebody as a go-between. Okay, that's the directly or indirectly. Or it could be, for example, a doctor could be in trouble through his company that did something. In return for referring an individual to a person in legal terms is not just a breathing person, but also a company can be a person in legal terms. So to somebody, like a hospital. I forgot one of the important parts. Soliciting or receiving any remuneration. Or you can solicit, receive, offer, or pay. Okay? Because meets the problem. For furnishing or arranging for the furnishing of any item or service can be paid for under federal health care program. Let me go through these, explain. So first of all, you have to do it knowingly and willfully. But interestingly, because of a change in the health that came about in healthcare reform, you don't have to knowingly and willfully violate the law. You only have to knowingly and willfully do the act. So if you do something that the government considers remuneration, you only have to know that you were doing whatever you were doing, giving something or asking for something. You don't have to know that doing that was a violation of the law. It's kind of like ignorance of the law is no excuse kind of thing. But it's a little more difficult because a lot of these things are considered kickbacks are things that most people don't think of as kickbacks. For example, in the United case, where the doctors were helping to get the contract, what was the remuneration? Somebody want to guess? Anybody think of anything with remuneration? We had doctors who were saying, please take this contract. What was the remuneration? And so I use the F word. Felony. It's a violation of the anti-kickback statute is a felony. Punishable up to 5 years in prison and exclusion. Or, up to $25,000 per violation and exclusion. Because if you get convicted of a felony healthcare crime, you get excluded automatically. The only question is how long. Or you could have it, all of it, the whole package, all three. Or they can, as I said before, they can get you under the civil monetary penalty law, where the numbers change. It's up to $50,000 per claim, up to 3 times the amount offered, paid, solicited, or received. And it doesn't matter. Now, let me tell you this part. Supposing that you pay somebody, supposing a hospital paid $3,000 for a service, and supposing fair market value was $2,500. They don't get you on the extra $500, they get you on the whole thing. It doesn't matter if one purpose was for a good purpose. One little bad purpose taints the whole thing. And that's also in a conviction where they convict you. They have what's called the one purpose test. If you had you could have 100 good motives and 1 bad motive. It's bad. And then exclusion under civil monetary penalty statute is discretionary to the OIG. They can exclude you or they cannot exclude you. Now, you can do a little math. Start adding every service is a claim, right? So it's up to $50,000 per claim, and then up to 3 times the amount you got. So you figure it out. If you had 100 services, it would be 50,000 times it, then add in the 3 times. You get to the big numbers very fast. I think that when we talked to the OIG the first time, I think that the number they were talking about, the maximum number is something like $34 million. So clearly we settled on less than 50,000 in less than 3 times. And that's how they get people. Because you know that among the many ways that the government gets you to settle is that you can quickly sit there and do the math. And then you got to decide what it could be and what will happen and yada yada, and they can exclude you, and you quickly see that, well, you have really good arguments and you really probably could win, but the other problem is that you don't get to court until a long time, because in a Medicare problem like this, the first thing that happens is you go to an administrative law judge. Administrative law judge, who is supposed to be impartial, is employed by the Department of Health and Human Services. He or she is not what they call an Article III judge. It's not the judges in the courts that you see, federal courts. Then if you, depending on what happens there, and then if you lose at the administrative law judge place, they can exclude you. All right? So they can exclude you right after that. Then you can appeal to the Department of Appeals Board, which is run by the Department of Health and Human Services. And then after you get through that part, and either side can appeal, so you just keep going. After that, and that's what happened in that one case I told you, it took years till they ever got to that case done. After the Department of Appeals Board, they put another level. There's an appeal to the Secretary of Health and Human Services. And then after you get through with her, you get to go to federal court. So you've already been excluded if you lost, and you've already paid all the legal fees to get there, and then you finally get to court. So you can see, and you can see what the numbers are, you can see why people settle. Right, who's subject to them? Who can be subject to the penalties? Anybody who is part of it. So the company, the managers, the executives who participate, salespersons, physicians, and anybody else. They got a lot of people to pick from. And if they want to, they'll get them all. So when you think about things and whether or not you want to report something and let us know that something is happening, remember, if you're involved, they can get you. There's no benefit to holding back.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
That's okay. No, ask questions.
No. When you say when you're involved, so you have, I mean, just to sort of bring it home here, you have a biller that files the claim.
Yeah, they're not. I don't think they're involved. No, but somebody who negotiated. Okay. Somebody talks. Somebody who's no. I don't know. Somebody who's passively sending things through. It's not.
Okay. So
right. No, they're not. But they should, if they notice it, they're good people to notice what's going on.
Right.
They're the kind of billers are the kind of people who can see that something looks phony, or people in accounts payable who notice that there's some very funny expenses going around. That kind of thing. Wait, did I?
Yeah.
responsibility to know the law, to understand United's policies and the code of conduct, to comply with the law, and to comply with the policies and procedures. If you have questions, ask, but it's your responsibility to comply. Nobody here is telling you not to comply. No one here is telling you not to do the right thing. We're telling you to do the right thing. It's your responsibility. If you don't understand something, ask. Remember, no limit on, no quote on questions. No question is too stupid. All right. Arrangements that potentially violate the PEG statute. It doesn't mean that they do, but often they can. You can have payments in excess of fair market value that violate the statute, and you can have payments that are lower than fair market value that violate the statute. So the question is, so one question might be, how could that be? But we'll talk about that. Payments for services that are not legitimate or not necessary. To be okay back. For example, how could that be? Somebody needs to rent space. Supposing that United needed space in a hospital, and for something, and they need one room, and instead the hospital says, yeah, if you want to get referrals that we send out of our ER, for example, to you for lithotripsy, you're going to have to rent not only that room, but the other room next to it that you're never going to use. Okay, so that would be something you're doing unnecessarily. That's the kickback, renting that so that they will send you the patients. Okay? Payments for referrals, money passes. But it doesn't have to be money. Payments for referrals can be a case of wine. Payments for referrals could be, I'll let you use my country house every month. Payments for referrals could be a very expensive dinner that you wouldn't normally have to get. Tickets to the theater, tickets to go see the Bears, tickets to go see the White Sox, or the, whatever else, the Cubs. Maybe you want to. Maybe it's not. Is it like first prize is a week in Philadelphia, and second prize is 2 weeks in Philadelphia. So maybe it's not so good. But okay, so payments for referrals, selective opportunities to invest. We'll take you because you're a big referrer. You're promising to bring all your patients. We won't take the other guy because he's not going to do it. Payments that vary with the volume or value of referrals, so that you pay. A good example is the hospital will pay you. So we don't let variable rates, volume discount. Volume. So the opposite of volume discount. So if you send us 10 patients, we'll pay $2,000 a patient. If you send us 25 patients, we'll pay $3,000 a case. It's an encouragement to bring more. Okay, we don't. You can't pay based on volume or value referrals. They also can't. Another way of looking at that is if they were willing to take the contract because a doctor refers a lot. That would be payments based on volume or value referrals. We wouldn't do the contract but for the fact that this person is sending a lot of patients. Okay. Threats to take patients to another hospital. We've talked about that. I can't emphasize it enough. Just, if you're going to do it, go. Just don't say anything. Promises or assurances that a contract will result in referrals. If you do this contract with us, we can assure you that our doctors will bring you another so-and-so number of cases. Promises that, or assurances that doctors will bring cases for other things. If you take this lithotripsy contract, we're sure that they're also going to bring other surgery. Gifts. Wine's always my favorite one, but there are a lot of other ones that you could give. The tickets, as I mentioned, expensive dinners, lending the house, anything like that. So anything that's excessive. Not if you bring a box of cookies because you happen to like the nurse and so you'll be nice and bring some cookies. If you stop at Dunkin' Donuts and bring some donuts in, I'm not going to worry about that. But things where you're constantly doing things, and you do it every once in a while. You're not the breakfast provider every morning for even from Dunkin' Donuts. All right, now the Stark Law. We'll talk about it again because it's kind of a flaky law and people don't always understand it. So a physician can't refer a patient, an individual, to an entity with which the physician or an immediate family member has a direct or indirect financial relationship for any designated health service paid for by Medicare or Medicaid. So, what does that mean? So it's not just the doctor, it's also the family member. So if the doctor doesn't have privileges at the hospital, but the wife does, or the child does, his immediate family members, then there's an issue. If it were a private hospital and the doctor's wife were the investor, the doctor was the man, then it would bring up the financial interest. And actually, it's harder to deal with usually when it's a family member. It's harder to be an exception sometimes than when it's the doctor, him or herself. It has to be payable by Medicare. That means that Medicare could pay it. It doesn't mean they paid it. For example, if it was within the deductible, that would be payable, even though they never got any Medicare money for it. Direct or indirect financial interest. Okay? And then the entity, the hospital, can't submit the claim. Oops. Again, as I told you, it's a civil statute, so you can't go to prison for it. You just pay a lot of bucks. Strict liability statute, as I told you, it doesn't matter whether you intended or not. No knowingly and willfully standard, just you did it. All right. One thing that gets people a lot are those unsigned contracts. Unsigned contracts are a big deal. There actually is even now an exception if you didn't sign the contract and you figured out within 30 days, if you knew about it, and there's another one for people who screw up completely. But it's very short. You got to be sure that the contract is signed. Somebody, probably more than one person, should check to see that those contracts are signed by both sides. And I know hospitals are impossible. And that's why when you do contracts, I really recommend that you do evergreen contracts. You know, so they will automatically renew. The hospitals say we don't want them. That's fine. Have a very short, have a time where they can cancel. You know, give them 30 days. You know, on 30 days' notice they can cancel it. The problem that happens is, as most people know, is that hospitals are notoriously slow in getting anything done. And you get to the point where the contract has expired. They've got a patient who needs a lithotripsy, and the contract isn't signed, and they can't get it signed because they've got 40 different processes before they can get it signed. And then everybody's going to be in violation, which we can't do, or the patient is going to get the service. So if you have an evergreen contract that's automatically renews with a short out, that's better. At least you'll have a contract in place. It's a constant problem. I see it over and over among clients. So and I've had many discussions with hospitals, and often I can convince them based on that. Sometimes you can't. They just will not do more than a contract, you know, that is evergreen. But it really is a serious problem for them and us. Okay, the penalties. You can't get paid for the service. Got to refund everything that the people paid. Penalty owes $15,000. I made a mistake. See, $15,000 per claim. If it's a circumvention scheme, it's $100,000. Now, what that means is, I know that I can't refer to XYZ because I have a financial interest that won't be an exception. And Julie Grego has a place that she's got a relationship with, and she can't refer to it. So we said, we have this great idea, they'll never figure it out. I'll send to Julie's company, and Julie will send to my company. That's a circumvention scheme. And that gets you a walloping big one. Okay? Now, you're still subject to more penalties under the civil monetary penalty law, and you can be excluded. So it's big stuff, and they can get you really easily on Stark. Got to get those contracts signed. All right, so what's an ownership interest? Stock, membership interests, okay, in an LLC. An option to buy is considered an ownership interest unless it was received for services. So if you had a doctor who had got the stock as a bonus payment, for example, for providing physician services, that would not be an ownership interest. Query what's the difference. But otherwise, a stock option is considered ownership because you have a concern that it'll do well, because if it does well, your option will be more valuable, right? Because options are, you buy it, you get it at a low price to buy something at a high price. So if the company does well, your option is worth a lot. And if your company doesn't do well, your option isn't worth very much. So options are considered ownership interests. Partnership interests, membership interests in LLCs. Debt is also considered an ownership interest. Now you might wonder why, so a bond, for example, or a promissory note is an ownership interest. Again, I think it's because for a couple of reasons. One of which is that you have a concern as to how well the company will do, and the other is that you can structure things so that debt is really the same benefit as equity. So they do that. Compensation arrangements. Anything where there's money moving around or some kind of benefit. So if you're employed, you have a compensation arrangement. An independent contractor, a doctor who provides independent contractor services to a hospital. If they get lease payments, so if a doctor leases something to a hospital, if they sell something, an unsecured loan. Secured loan is considered an ownership, an unsecured loan. Certain gifts. $300 was the original amount that under Stark, and it's actually higher. I have to look it up every year, but I like to use 300 as the amount that everybody listens, and then we figure out whether it matters or not. And stock options, and convertible securities are given in return for service. Now, why do we care about all these things? Well, the problem is that we know what the relationship is with the hospital between United and the hospital. We know the contract. But you don't know what else other doctors have. And so you want to be sure that you don't have some other doctor having some other kind of relationship that you don't know about. Now, on the gifts part, if you give, if the company were to give something to the hospital, that had some value, like, if it's got to be under $300 a year, or otherwise you have another relationship that isn't going to be an exception. So if you bought, I don't know what, for the hospital, but not a charity gift, if it's real charity. Easiest ways to not do that stuff. Okay, what's an indirect ownership interest? Okay, it is an unbroken chain of ownership interest, and those are the ones that are hard to meet, and we're not going to have an issue here, but I thought I'd tell you about it because we've got to use it. So we have Dr. Mills owns stock in Tiffany Holdings, and Tiffany Holdings owns 10% of an MRI center. Okay, that would be an indirect ownership interest between Dr. Mills and the MRI center. He doesn't own it directly. He doesn't own it directly. He owns it through Tiffany Holdings, and so it looks kind of like that, unbroken chain. So that's now indirect compensation arrangement. It's an unbroken chain of two or more financial relationships, one of which has to be compensation. So if you look at the doctors, even though the doctors have an ownership interest in United, they have an indirect compensation arrangement with the hospital because it's a mixture of ownership and compensation. It's the ownership interest between the hospital, it's the ownership between the doctor and United, and it's the compensation arrangement between the hospital and United because they pay a fee to use the service. Now, this is how we tell. If United always was paid a flat fee, say $10,000 a month to do all the lithotripsy, you would not have an indirect compensation arrangement. We wouldn't have to worry about Stark. It's because it's a per procedure amount. If what happens is, if the doctor sends, by any doctor sending more patients, the doctor's overall compensation from United changes, then there's indirect compensation arrangement. Now, we have to think, and this was a hard one for everybody to figure out when the Stark Law came out. The doctors are only paid distributions based on what they own. They're not paid based on what they refer, right? But what happens is that the pool of distributions gets bigger the more they refer, right? And that's why they talk about aggregate, the whole. So the doctors have an indirect compensation arrangement because the more they refer, the bigger the pool that their distributions come from, even though they're only going to be paid based on what they own. Okay? And then the entity has to know about their arrangement. You will find more and more that hospitals should be asking whether or not you have doctor ownership. And you need to tell them. You do have to tell them because they have to have it because they're going to have to report. Now, what I have done often is I try to get confidentiality agreements with the hospitals because you don't want people poaching your owners or doing something with what they know. And so I try to get them, we'll give it to you, but we want you to sign something that says you're only going to use it for the purpose of reporting for Stark and for nothing else. All right, so, Dr. Mills owns membership interest in Tiffany Lithotripsy, and Tiffany Lithotripsy has a contract with Winston Hospital. So if Dr. Mills is going to refer patients to Winston for anything other than lithotripsy, surgery, radiology, whatever, that indirect compensation arrangement because of the lithotripsy has to mean an exception. And that's why we care, even though lithotripsy is not a designated health service. Because the hospital is going to have problems, and then you're going to have problems, because the government thinks that by you not dealing with that relationship, that you have caused the claim to be presented. Now, no one knows what causes to be presented means. There's nothing in the legislative history in Congress that explains what it means, but that's what the government says it means, and nobody has the power to challenge them. So here we are. So here's the picture. You got Dr. Tiffany Holdings in Winston Hospital, and that's the indirect compensation arrangement. And then this is what happens. Right? The doctor is only getting distributions based on ownership. You've got a fee of X amount per procedure, and you got it covered. We draw these nice little pictures all the time. So what do you need? These are the requirements. You have to have a written agreement signed by the parties. Fair market value compensation not determined by volume of arrow referrals or other business generated by the doctor. So for example, you can't get a better fee for lithotripsy because this is the doctor who does a lot of surgery at the hospital. Okay? Fees can't change because you've got a really good hit, a big hitter, who is going to use the service. It's got, so fair market value, and what the government thinks is fair market value when a doctor is involved, is what somebody else would pay. They don't think that just negotiating a contract when there's a doctor company makes it fair market value. Normally, how do you figure, the way you figure out fair market value compensation, if I were going to negotiate with Bruce on a legal fee, we would just go back and forth for what the fee should be, and that's considered fair market value, whatever we agree on, because we're disinterested parties. He doesn't owe anything to me, and I don't owe anything to him, and whatever we agree on is fair market value. But if you have a doctor involved in the company, and the doctor then has dealings with the hospital, the government says that whatever you negotiate is not fair market value just by negotiating it. And that's why, because there's no physician ownership in the laser company anymore, we don't need to prove fair market value, because it's assumed to be fair market value because it's just disinterested parties. Okay? You can have per procedure compensation for lithotripsy, and you can't violate the anti-kickback statute or state laws on billing and claim submission. So there were really, if the government was correct that there were kickback violations in the contracts, then there were automatically Stark violations. Because one of the exceptions requires you not violate the anti-kickback statute. So it's very unfairly, if you violate one, you get the other. And they just pile up the violations and the money. How can you violate the statute? One, no written agreement. Again, it's not signed by somebody. So you have an agreement. Yeah, we have an agreement, but it's not signed by somebody. The way you have a contract is it's got to be signed, or it's not a contract. And maybe when you look at it, it looks like a contract, but it's not a valid contract if everybody didn't sign it. What if the arrangement violated the anti-kickback statute? You have a violation. If compensation is not fair market value, again here, if the compensation varies with volume and value referrals, then it will not be fair market value of a violation. Okay. There's going to be a system in the computer system that is going to track referrals. Now, what we're going to have to do is look at even the ones you start with, because you have to know that they were done correctly. So when you approach a hospital, you're going to have to let whoever is in charge know. So Jim, I guess, is the one who will know. When there is, you enter it in, or you have somebody doing it. No one cares if you actually do it. Name of the hospital, who's the contact, and keep track of whether or not a doctor's been involved so you know. And then watch it progress. And if it ends up in a contract, then we got to be sure that everything is entered into the system. So the name of the contract, lithotripsy services contract, whatever. Who the parties are, the state where it's located, so we know we've got Iowa, Illinois, and Indiana covered. The effective date of the contract, the term